So our next speaker is going to show us how data and the police get together. Her name is Trina Reynolds-Tyler, and I just have to tell you, she comes from the Invisible Institute, and she flew in yesterday from the south side of Chicago on her birthday to be here with us. Trina, thanks so much for coming.
Did you have the clicker? Awesome. And I just pressed the green. Hi, everyone. My name is Trina Reynolds-Tyler. I'm also known as Trina T. I'm data director at the Invisible Institute, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalism organization who primarily investigates police misconduct. There, I lead Beneath the Surface, a project that uses narrative justice and data science to interrogate the intersection of gender-based violence and police misconduct. I feel it's important to start off with, this is a very triggering conversation, and it involves some of our most intimate parts of our lives. It not only takes a lot to have experienced the traumatic event, but to have experienced that event at the hands of police and then to come forward and file a complaint is something that takes a tremendous amount of effort. And I'd like to ground us in the folks who couldn't even make it today, who are no longer with us due to the immense weight of what that experience looks like. I'll start us off in a bit of history. So in the year 2000, the city of Chicago announced in the city of Chicago, there was a 4-mile stretch of public housing that was really close to the center of Chicago. Stateway Gardens was just a fraction of that public housing corridor. And it was at some point known as the largest concentration of poverty in the nation. It was slowly deteriorating over time. See, as the buildings were bulldozed due to the plan for transformation, you know, we're going to demolish these buildings and build new houses. Buildings were bulldozed and people remained living in the complexes right next door. As of today, those buildings have never been rebuilt, thereby displacing thousands of families. That area was policed by a group of officers known as a skull cap crew. People knew them for the clothes that they wore. They were named in over 20 federal lawsuits and over 60 civilian allegations of misconduct, many people describing officers forcing themselves into their homes, using extreme force against their bodies, against their children's bodies. One of the people who encountered members of the skull cap crew was Diane Bond. As she was walking out of her house on April 13, 2003, she encountered them, a couple members of them, and they put a gun to her and they said, "Where do you live?" and forced their way back up to her 8th floor apartment. There, they not only traumatized her son, but also took her into the bathroom and searched her body for drugs, sexually violating her in her bathroom. A couple weeks later, she ran into them again in the stairwell. They punched her in the face, dragged her up the stairs back to her apartment, forced their way into her bedroom, and had her lay on the bed and reach into herself to search for drugs. This sexual violation was extremely traumatizing for her, and luckily, by way of her proximity to Jamie Calvin, she gained access to a lawyer and filed a lawsuit against the city of Chicago. Now, this behavior was not new. In 1972, the Blue Ribbon Panel was a 4-day series of public hearings where people spoke about their encounters with police regularly. And a US representative said, you know, you will be hard-pressed to go to any black ghetto and not find somebody who either has direct experience with police violence or at least knows some firsthand information of it having occurred before. Jamie Calvin filed a FOIA lawsuit in an attempt to gain access to disciplinary records, misconduct records. See, like Diane Bond, many people had filed complaints against the Chicago Police Department, but not many of them were sustained. Not everyone had access to a lawyer. Not everyone was deemed a credible witness. In 2014, it went all the way down to the Illinois Supreme Court, and it was deemed that police misconduct records are public information. We gained access to, initially, 5 years worth of data, created the Citizens Police Data Project where you could filter through by location, by officer name, by complaint type. Today, That database houses the data from 1988 to 2021. What we learned was that there were lots of people filing complaints against the Chicago Police Department, and there was not much discipline happening. And that primarily people were filing complaints about operation and personnel violations, illegal search, and use of force. Specifically in the operation and personnel violations, folks spoke about the failure to provide service and the neglect of duty. One of the things that really troubled me as I began to parse through the CPDP database in 2016 as an AmeriCorps member was the issue of primary categorization. So when we look at complaints, all we have is this metadata, information about the officer name, maybe the time and date that the incident occurred, and the primary categorization, right? In a single instance, there may be several encounters of types of abuse, but this investigator determines which one is the most egregious, and that becomes the category which is displayed at the very top level. We knew we could find more information if we had access to underlying documents. And luckily, a man named Charles Green, who was incarcerated for a murder that he didn't commit, submitted a FOIA request in 2015 for the underlying documents going back to 1967. Because the city of Chicago blew their deadline, they could not simply tell him that his request was unduly burdensome. We knew the documents were coming, we just didn't know when or how we would receive them. This opportunity would change what we initially see as an illegal search by a black officer against a black woman to a sexual violation, an instance where during lockup, an officer told a woman, if you show me this, I'll let you out the back door, presses up on her, and then says, well, you still getting a possession charge. Now, we knew more stories like this existed. This phenomena was very widespread, right? It wasn't just even one type of complaint. It was a way of flattening the narratives of people. And we were extremely interested in not only being able to better quantify the number of sexual violations that occurred at the hands of police, but also to see if the investigators who went into the files actually thought of the encounter as a sexual violation at all, too. We created Beneath the Surface, right? This opportunity to go behind the scenes of an investigation, beneath this primary category level, and deeper into the shared experiences of people. It's one thing when one person is talking about an encounter that they had with a single officer, but what are the ways that stories connect people across time and space? With the support of HRDAG and a whole boatload of people in Chicago, we decided to create an algorithm named Judy. Shout out to Judy, one of the folks at WIDS also. This was a way that we would do a more targeted search, right? Volunteers would read through training data in order to label the complaints as relevant or not relevant. We would run a topic model with our metadata to generate features for Judy, who would ultimately spit out a bunch of scores, which would, in Patrick Ball's words, turn a needle in a haystack to a haystack full of needles. This project was really near and dear to not only my heart, but also shared many stories of, again, many people in the community. So before we even got started, oh, I'm pressing the wrong, so we came back to this emphasis on what complainants had in common instead of this emphasis on finding the bad apples, finding the individual officer or the cluster of officers who are doing something wrong, and leaning into what the complainants had in common. We started with the documents pipeline team, a collaboration between the Lucy Parsons Lab, HRDAG, and Invisible Institute team members who processed the documents, helped identify specific report types that we would need in order to get access to the narratives, and then we sent those right over to the volunteers who were provided an annotation dictionary, including selectors like neglect, sexual violation, domestic, home, disabled, and LGBTQIA. These reading groups were extremely important because they helped us to better craft our annotation dictionary and ensure inter-radar reliability, ensure that people had an actual shared definition, a shared ability to tag a narrative as relevant or not relevant. But it also helped us in a couple months later when we received over 200 volunteers who were extremely enthusiastic about tagging narratives, but were not sure where to go. The infrastructure that we initially started with, reading groups A and reading groups B, gave us insight on anticipated sensitive conversations, gave us insight on the way that people would respond, their frustrations with reading the same narrative, feeling like they were reading the same narrative over and over and over again. And then, of course, we had code review, where we met every Friday, a group of predominantly Black folks and data scientists at HRDAG, where we were vulnerable, threw some code on the screen, took turns interpreting the findings, and learned together. Because beneath the surface is not just a project about data science and playing and tinkering with tools. It's about including the people in the process from the very beginning so that at the very end, when we do have our findings, the people who are most impacted are already on board and aware of what is possible to find. Now, we had many haystacks full of needles, and so I won't go into details about all of the various different types of complaints that we found, but I will focus on one, which is response to sexual assault. Right. So this on screen is an example from a complaint that we were able to identify through Judy, where a woman came into a station and she was visibly bruised. She was extremely disrespected, allegedly, by these officers. She later was able to get a report, and she filed a complaint against the people who she encountered that day. Now, outside of her story, we found 89 other complaints that shared characteristics, 38 cases where people refused to file a report, 11 cases where folks were victim blames, and more than a quarter of them, the survivor of sexual assault was a minor. Today, we're investigating missing persons cases in Chicago. Not only were we able to identify 54 complaints where people expressed frustration with officers when attempting to file their loved one missing, we also stumbled upon a complaint where a police officer delivered a 14-year-old missing girl to be trafficked. That officer was let go, able to resign, keep his pension, and become an officer somewhere else. And another officer was charged with human trafficking of runaway girls. At the end of our first few iterations of Judy, I reflected on the feedback that volunteers provided to us after every time they tagged. I knew that many of them wished that they could label other types of complaints, and I would often hear them say the same things. We wish we could tag involuntary commitment to mental institutions. We wish we could tag destruction of property. Lots of people were so frustrated that I didn't tag the race of the person. I had to remind them that that was information that we had access to by way of the metadata. But there was still not a clear opportunity to implement some of their interest in tagging different types of documents until Maurice Rabb, Stanford alumni, came to the Invisible Institute and asked us if we'd like to be a part of the MLK Hackathon of 2022. They created an interface which allowed us to not only make the narratives more accessible to people who are labeling things, moving us away from Google Sheets and into an application, but also gave us an opportunity to, in the back end, generate different types of training data. At the end of the day, all of these complaints came from the Independent Police Review Authority between 2011 and 2015. That entity no longer exists. That's the same entity that fumbled the Laquan McDonald case. Today, although we have the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, allegations of misconduct are going down because of distrust in the system. Now, what proportion of human rights violations are potentially reflected in one complaint? That is what I'll leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.